It's not. So I would now like to welcome you to the lecture series, The Critical Gaze, Reflections on Global Crises in Portuguese Language Comics at the University of Cologne. My name is Yannick Scholz. I'm a research assistant at the Portuguese-Brazilian Institute of the University of Cologne. And it is my very pleasure to introduce a very dear colleague and today's guest, Jasmin Wrobel. Jasmin Wrobel did her bachelor and her master training in Romance and Comparative Literature at the Ruhr-Universität Bochum. And from 2013 to 2019, she was a research assistant at the Latin American Institute of the Freie Universität Berlin, where she worked on her PhD project on Haroldo de Campos' Galaxias and the Poetics of Stumbling, Poetik des Stolperns in German. The study was published by De Gruyter in 2020, and since 2019, she holds a position as research track postdoc and academic coordinator at the Cluster of Excellence 2020, entitled Temporal Communities Doing Literature in a Global Perspective. Just a second, sorry. Jasmin is highly productive. She did both research and teaching in Spain, in Brazil, in Chile, and in Israel, and published on experimental poetry, border literature, and Latin American comics. I would like to recommend one English text, which is strongly connected to the topic of our lecture series today, which was published in 2017 about the protagonism of Afro-Brazilians in the work of graphic novelist Marcelo De Salecci, published in Vinícius Carvalho's and Nicola Gavioli's book, Literature and Ethics in Contemporary Brazil. Another text, still on Brazilian comics, but this one written in German, is in print and has aroused my interest and my curiosity as it analyzes comic adaptations of Jorge Amado's Jubiabá and Milton Atum's Doisia Maus, and is entitled in German Intermediale Transposition literarischer Malandragem. Next to the aforementioned research interests, Jasmin also works on literary and cultural context between the Americas, the so-called border literature, on Baroque and Neo-Baroque literature in Spain, Portugal, and Latin America, and on literary representations of memory discourses. Her current research project has to do with the discovery, conquest, and takeover of the panel as venue of feminist discourses, women characters in the Spanish and Latin American comic production. And if I'm not totally mistaken, today's talk combines both the interests in Afro-Latin American literature and feminist graphic narratives, as it deals with the visibility, representation, and protagonism of Afro-Brazilian women in graphic narratives. Jasmin, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your insights on that interesting and important topic. And you might start if you want.
Thank you so much, Yannick, for your kind words and introduction, and also for the invitation to this lecture series, which really has been a highlight for me this semester, which has been very dark and lonely. And so this Monday with you, colleagues, esteemed colleagues at Köln, at University zu Köln, was really always a highlight I was looking forward to. And yeah, I will begin my considerations. I don't know if you can hear me. Maybe I'm just going to start my presentation. Hope this is going to work. Could anyone give me, yeah, okay. I will begin my considerations with a short contextualization of the topic I'm going to present within a broader debate on representation and visibility and of the historical background against which the stories we're going to see unfold. I have to confess that my original focus on Afro-Brazilian women, including the material I intended to present, has shifted a little bit, and that some of you already know some parts of this research, so I have to apologize to these specific colleagues. But I think and I hope that my talk will dialogue quite nicely with Ivan's talk last week. In his polemic opening speech at the Frankfurt Book Fair in 2013, Brazilian author Luis Rufato exposed the idea of a racial democracy, which supposedly marks Brazilian culture and society, as a myth. At the same time, he denounced as genocide the extreme decimation of the approximately 4 million indigenous peoples who lived in the Brazilian territory back in 1500, and emphasized that the so-called assimilation of the African and native inhabitants was a consequence of the rape of indigenous and African women by white colonizers. Rufato went on to say that by the middle of the 19th century, 5 million Africans had been brought to Brazil by force, more than in any other country. As you all know, Brazil was the last nation on the American continent to abolish slavery in 1888 with the so-called Lei Áurea, the Golden Act, because it was signed with the golden quill by Isabel, Princess Imperial of Brazil. Despite this act, the formerly enslaved men and women were not allowed to integrate into society as active participants. Many of them left the plantations, but returned shortly after under even worse working conditions, as they were not able to find employment elsewhere. In the cities, they had to compete with immigrant workers and found themselves in marginalized circumstances. As there was nowhere to go, many of them moved into the emerging favelas in the outskirts or hills of the city, some of the first settlements being called bairros africanos, African neighborhoods. The consequences of the lack of any thorough review of the still undigested historical past led to the situation one can observe in contemporary Brazil, namely that a large percentage of Afro-Brazilians, the Afro-Brazilian population, remain on the bottom rungs of society. And this is also reflected in their representation in contemporary Brazilian literature, which leaves much to be desired, not least because of structural discrimination, a fact that we could also illustrate taking the example of the Frankfurt Book Fair of 2013. Paulo Lins, author of the well-known bestseller Cidade de Deus, City of God, and Desde que o Samba é Samba, published in 2012. The German translation was published in 2013. In the year of the book fair, also a reason why he was invited. Paulo Lins was the only Afro-Brazilian among the 70 invited writers from Brazil, a fact that led to polemic discussions and to Paulo Coelho's decision not to attend the fair in protest, commercially the most successful Brazilian writer. In 2018, and this is even more important in our context today, the distinguished Afro-Brazilian writer Conceição Evaristo stood as a candidate for the Academia Brasileira de Letras, the Brazilian Academy of Letters, and lost to filmmaker Cacá Diegues by 22 votes to 1. Evaristo would have been the first Black female member in the Academy. What is more, at an event in honor of Carolina Maria de Jesus, one of the first Afro-Brazilian female writers and one of the most important references, not only for Conceição Evaristo, the literary value and quality of her autobiographical writing was questioned publicly by a member of the Academia Carioca de Letras, by Ivan Cavalcanti Proença, in 2017. In October of 2018, one day after the Brazilian general election, I participated in a conference titled Declinations, Questioning National, Gender and Sexual Identities in Lisbon, together with colleagues from Portugal, Angola, Mozambique, and of course, Brazil. Even if at that point, the election of Jair Bolsonaro, a person, as we all know, that insulted and threatened women, Afro-Brazilians, indigenous peoples, and queer persons explicitly and in public, and who dedicated his vote in favor of the impeachment of former President Dilma Rousseff to the colonel who tortured her during the military dictatorship, even if his election at that point did not come as a surprise, we felt shocked and paralyzed. Instead of simply going over to a conference routine, we discussed and analyzed the meaning of this election's outcome for Brazil and for all of us, really. And more importantly, questioned the role of academia, given the new political and societal constellations, especially in the field of literary and cultural studies. We all agreed on the urgent importance of reconnecting our mainly theoretical work with social debates in the non-academic world. Therefore, I'm very grateful for this lecture series, Yannick and Peter, because it connects and brings into dialogue perspectives from different countries, continents, from different disciplines, and also positions in relation to a medium, namely comics, that I believe can play and already plays a decisive role in the bidirectional transfer of discourses between academic research and the non-academic world. When we talk about comics and the representation of Black diasporic life, we certainly first have to address that this is a very sensitive and adversarial topic. Throughout history, caricatures and comics have exposed and reproduced systemic racism and ethnic misattributions in much more explicit ways than most other modes of cultural expression. Characters native to the African continent have been depicted in comics since the beginning of the modern comic strip, and they did so often in the form of racist stereotypes, as for example, the spear-carrying cannibal or the noble savage. As the Afro-American scholar, author, and cartoonist Charles Richard Johnson commented in this context, and I paraphrase, the depiction of these ur-images of Blacks in the history of comics are a testament to the failure of the imagination and often of empathy too, and tell us nothing about Black people, but everything about what white audiences approved and felt comfortable with at a specific time. On the other hand, research in cultural and media studies has centered on the crucial role of archives and the archival practices and graphic narratives in the past few decades, and especially in the last years. As Hilary Chute argues, comics and graphic narratives not only thematize archives, but further, because of the pictorial word and image format of their pages, they are able to actually incorporate or physically represent concrete archives. With regards to imagery of Black figures, this mode of physical contestation in the sense of a self-archive or a counter-archive, furthermore can entail a critical resistance to the white gaze. 2018 and 2019 are not only the years in which respectively Bolsonaro was elected and became president of Brazil, they are also the years in which, and I'm coming to my two examples. On the one hand, Marcelo De Salecci is awarded with his a prestigious Eisner Award in the category Best US Edition of International Material in 2018 for Kumbi, translated by Andrea Rosenberg, with a more descriptive title, Run for It, Stories of Slaves Who Fought for Their Freedom. I also want to mention that in 2019, he and his German translator, Lea Hübner, who you all know by now, who is with us today, won the German Rudolf Dirks Award in the category South and Central America Best Scenario, in addition to several other awards. Celene Barbosa's and João Pinheiro's graphic biography of Carolina Maria de Jesus, on the other hand, wins the Ecumenic Jury Award of the Angoulême Festival in 2019, the most important European comic festival, creating thus visibility for a female Black author that even in Brazil is widely ignored and whose literary relevance, as I said earlier, is still being questioned by parts of the Brazilian Academy. Now, these might seem small victories in comparison to the election of Bolsonaro, but I think it is especially this kind of achievements that create international awareness for voices like Carolina's, and on the other hand, the history of slavery or colonial history in Brazil and its implications for today, visualization of counter narratives that Ivan talked about last week. I'm coming after quite a long introduction to the first part of my presentation. Carolina Maria de Jesus grew up in the state of Minas Gerais, but lived for the most part of her life in Favela do Canindé in São Paulo as a single mother of 3 children, working as a catadora, a garbage collector or waste picker. She collected paper and then resold it afterwards. Carolina had hardly been alphabetized in the 2 years she attended school as a child, but had developed nevertheless a desperate craving for reading very early. She collected books in the streets and in 1955 started to write a diary. By chance, and one could question if this was in fact a lucky constellation and for whom, she met Audálio Dantas, a journalist who came to Canindé in 1958 because he wanted to write a report on favela life. We see him here with Carolina in Canindé. When he was speaking to the residents, and I'm going to show some scenes from the comic, he suddenly heard Carolina arguing with some of them, threatening them. Vou botar o nome de vocês no meu livro. So he asked her for the book she was talking about, and of course a diary written by a Canindé resident was the most authentic material that he could lay hands on for his report, but he also saw literary potential in her writing, and in the end helped her to publish her diary. The diary, which covers the years between 1955 and 1960, she continued writing it after meeting Audálio Dantas, was published in 1960 with the title Quarto de Despejo, Diário de uma Favelada. Quarto de Despejo meaning dumping room, a metaphor she uses for Favela do Canindé, and had a rather unexpected success. 10,000 copies were sold in the first 3 days, more than 100,000 copies in a few months. Until today, Quarto de Despejo has been published in 40 countries in 14 languages, making it one of the most widely read books in Brazilian publishing history. In the United States, the diary was published in 1962, translated by David Sinclair with the title Child of the Dark, the Diary of Carolina Maria de Jesus, and in the same year, it came out in Germany with the title Tagebuch der Armut, translated by Johannes Gerold. The subtitle we see here was only changed in 1983 to Das Leben in einer brasilianischen Favela, Life in a Brazilian Favela. These titles, but also the covers, show the appeal the responsible translators or the publishing houses, but also Audálio Dantas in the original version, tried to create by something we could call Schaulust, or a German type of morbid curiosity, or rubbernecking in English. Maybe someone has a more appropriate word for this. Her book was a global success, as I said before, but she rose and fell from the public eye very fast, probably for 2 reasons. First, she was seen as a type of strange phenomenon by her middle and upper middle class readers who enjoyed to read an authentic life story directly from the favelas, and we can see this here on the covers. But when Carolina began to write about them, and she did that when she moved out from Canindé, criticizing her new neighbors in the book Casa Di Avenalia, her writings were no longer appreciated. What is more, voices like Carolina's were being silenced since the beginning of the military dictatorship in 1964, as they denounced the consequences and repercussions of social inequality in Brazil. Quarto de Despejo simply was not edited anymore during the late 60s and in the 70s. Brazilian comic artist João Pinheiro came across Carolina Maria de Jesus's work by a mere coincidence when he was searching for new material in a second-hand bookstore in São Paulo. Selene Barbosa, his partner to whom he showed what he had found and who is a PhD student in educational studies, was already preoccupied with the absence of Black writers in the school curriculum at that time, and she got fascinated by Carolina Maria de Jesus's work and her life story. Together, the couple decided to create a graphic biography of the author, bringing Carolina back to awareness for a new readership. Besides a short prologue and an epilogue that frame the narrative in an inverted structure, beginning with the end of Carolina's life and ending with her childhood, the book consists of 3 parts or chapters, each of them being introduced by a different diary title. Muito bem, Carolina, which narrates some live episodes between the 15th of July of 1955, the day Carolina begins to write her diary, until 1958. The second part, with the title Escrevivências, actually a term coined by Conceição Evaristo, that focuses on the chance meeting between Carolina and the journalist Audálio Dantas, and on the publication of her diary in 1960. The third part, entitled Vedete da Favela, Favela Star, which is actually the title of one of the sambas Carolina composed, narrates her life after the success of Quarto de Despejo, her moving from Favela do Canindé to a masonry house in Santana, a middle-class neighborhood in São Paulo. In her diary, Carolina evidences the polarity of São Paulo's urban centers and peripheries by making an insightful comparison referring herself metaphorically to the city as the living room and to Favela do Canindé, where she lived between 1947 and 1960 as the dumping room, precisely quarto de despejo of society. I'm going to read the Portuguese quotation. Quando estou na cidade, tenho a impressão que estou na sala de visita, com seus lustres de cristais, seus tapetes de veludo, almofadas de cetim. E quando estou na favela, tenho a impressão que sou um objeto fora de uso, digno de estar num quarto de despejo. There are actually, as you can see, some misspellings here. Audálio Dantas kept for the major part Carolina's form of expression. In Silene Barbosa's and João Pinheiro's graphic novel Carolina, this metaphorical dichotomy is taken up and transformed into the scenery and driving force of the visualization of Carolina's life and her literary work. The first eye contact between the protagonist and the reader is established in passing in one of São Paulo's crowded streets. And here again, we see that João Pinheiro incorporates photographs in his graphic work. As readers, we are put into the participatory position of a passerby who crosses path with the writer. This ephemeral moment of the first encounter with Carolina Maria de Jesus is accompanied, or rather commented, by a poster on a wall nearby that shows a quote from the short story Abraçado do Meu Rancor by João Antônio Ferreira Filho. In the story, this quote is a slogan aimed at bohemians in a bar, referring to São Paulo's attractive nightlife. In Barbosa's and Pinheiro's graphic novel, the same slogan expresses quite a different meaning. Being presented on a poster, it is transformed into an unofficial caption that does not only fit Carolina's difficult living conditions, in the night of São Paulo, you forget that day will dawn, but also adopts the specific discouraged tone of the other text boxes where we can read, trying to translate, hunger. She feels growling when this word comes to her mind. Hunger is the worst of all diseases. Is this going to be her destiny, to fight every day for the rest of her life, only to calm her hunger? During her long way home through the urban labyrinth of São Paulo, carrying a big bag full of paper on her back and being humiliated by other passers-by, Carolina constantly repeats to herself as if it was her mantra, "Sou poetisa, I'm a poetess." We can follow her here through the streets of São Paulo. The following panels show precisely the metaphorical dichotomy I mentioned earlier, including as captions Carolina's famous comparison between city and favela life. While we are zooming in on the faces of the inhabitants of the living room of society who are being shown in fragmented close-ups, eating and laughing in an almost monstrous way, the other page is characterized by wide angles that show the omnipresent misery, solitude, and starvation in Favela do Canindé, represented by the crows and the dog devouring some pieces of garbage. This perspective on the favela is also mirrored in Carolina's general view of the city. While to her it only offers leftovers and trash, the upper middle class citizens have an abundance of food at their disposal. In Quarto de Despejo, she observes, again emphasizing the polarity of city and favela. I quote, "Quando eu vou na cidade, tenho a impressão que estou no paraíso. Acho sublime ver aquelas mulheres e crianças tão bem vestidas, tão diferentes da favela. As casas com seus vasos de flores e cores variadas. Aquelas paisagens há de encantar os olhos dos visitantes de São Paulo, que ignoram que a cidade mais afamada da América do Sul está enferma, com as suas úlceras, as favelas." It is important to remember in that context that Carolina never romanticized favela life. Quite the contrary, she demolishes the stereotype of the united, solidary, and cordial favelados, but shows her neighbors as human beings with qualities and imperfections that are independent from their socioeconomic conditions. As I said earlier, Carolina's literary chronicle was a somewhat unexpected success when it was published in 1960 and allowed her to move to a better home in Santana. Barbosa and Pinheiro draw the reader's attention to the different reactions the author receives from her environment, which vary between surprise and disbelief, but also racist commentaries, as documented on the first page of the third chapter of Carolina. At the same time, she received recognition and appreciation from other Brazilian authors, even from Clarice Lispector. There's this anecdote when the two of them met at an event, and Carolina was with her daughter Vera Eunice and told her, look, there's Clarice Lispector, she's a real writer. And Clarice heard that and comes to her and says, no, you are a real writer because you write reality. This is this anecdote they're using here. Shortly after this first success, however, the initial approval begins to decrease. Carolina is not seen as an equal in upper middle class society, but more as a curiosity that slowly begins to annoy. She perceives very quickly, and I'm summing up the captions here, that even if she's the author of one of the major bestsellers of all time, the local media and the high society will always see her as a second-class writer. They consumed her, and we see this moment of Gaffen, of Schaulust, rubbernecking represented in the panels. They consumed her just like they would a type of product that you use and then throw away, a bitter analogy to her own metaphor of the favela as a quarto de despejo, as a dumping room. Her second book, Casa Di Avenalia, published in 1961, does not achieve the same success as Quarto de Despejo. In Celine Barbosa's and João Pinheiro's graphic novel, The Fall of the Writer, the process of sliding into oblivion is staged visually precisely through the pages, the paper that led to her fame, falling like autumn leaves and making Carolina disappear from the reader's eye, turning her invisible again. The graphic novel is based mainly on 3 books by Carolina Maria de Jesus, Quarto de Despejo, Casa Di Avenalia, and the posthumously published Diário de Bichita. Furthermore, they work with text fragments from the sambas she composed. In the context of literary circulation, the publication history of Diário de Bichita is particularly noteworthy because the original manuscripts, according to her daughter Vera Eunice and de Jesus Lima, were lent to a French publishing house in the 70s when Carolina was still alive and never returned. In 1982, 5 years after her death, the work was published in France with the modified title Journal de Bichita. Bichita was her nickname as a child, instead of the title chosen by Carolina for this work, which would have been Brasil para Brasileiros, without prior authorization from the copyright holders in addition. The book was republished in Brazil only in 1986 by the publishing house Nova Fronteira, following the title of the French edition and being translated therefore into Diário de Bichita. The edition to which Brazilians have access today was therefore translated from Carolinian Portuguese, Carolina's very own literary code, into French, and from there into a more formal Portuguese, following the French more formal translation. The reader notices the presence, or rather intrusion, of other voices in the narrative that brings Carolina's form of enunciation, marked by a colloquial tone and with linguistic characteristics of verbal and or nominal nonconformities, into a more standardized form. The previously published works, even if they are also edited, maintained in most cases the originality of her writing and form of expression. Recently, these original manuscripts of Brasil para Brasileiros have finally returned to Brazil and were archived in the Moreira Salles Institute in Rio de Janeiro. As a last point here, I would like to emphasize the importance of 3 academics for the circulation of Carolina Maria de Jesus' work, both nationally and internationally. In the United States, the historian and Latin Americanist Robert M. Levine, and from University of Miami, and José Carlos Sebe Bomei from University of São Paulo in particular, have rendered an outstanding effort to prevent Carolina from falling into oblivion. And in Brazil, it is particularly thanks to the academic Rafaela Fernandes that several of Carolina's previously unpublished works have been released in recent years. One could really say that Rafaela dedicated her academic life to Carolina Maria de Jesus, which is quite impressive. Regarding the relevance of academics in relation to legitimacy, I would like to quote Brazilian scholar Regina da Castanhe, who emphasizes regarding Carolina's legacy, and I quote, "Almost always disadvantaged in social and economic life, those included in the marginalized group have the possibility of speaking for themselves and the surrounding world stolen. Literature supported by its codes and traditions and its keepers may, knowingly or not, confirm this practice, thereby excluding and marginalizing. Thus, it loses a plurality of perspectives that would be enriching. Inclusion in the literary field as a question of legitimacy, perhaps more than in other fields. In this sense, academic research and criticism are not devoid of relevance. After all, they are important spaces of legitimation in addition to the acknowledged creators. Reading Carolina Maria de Jesus as literature, placing her among established names such as Guimarães Rosa and Clarice Lispector, instead of relegating her to the status of testimony or document, means accepting her diction as legitimate, able to create beauty and enchantment, even if it is removed from the standards established by the elite writers. Now, this very lecture series has the title, The Critical Gaze, in relation, I think, at least in the first place, to the conflictive field of comics and representation. But Dal Castanhe reminds us here of our own gatekeeping position as scholars and academics, and to therefore apply critical gaze also to who we include in our curricula and also to who we quote in our research. Coming to my second example, which is going to be shorter in this part of my talk, Marcelo De Salecci, just like Silene Barbosa and João Pinheiro, was born and still lives in São Paulo, which became one of the main settings for his graphic narratives. His first book project, Noite Luz, was published in 2008 and is composed of 6 graphic stories linked both by their setting, a lower class neighborhood in the Brazilian metropolis, and by the social conditions of their protagonists. In his drawings, De Salecci reveals and documents the problematic sides of contemporary urban culture that affects his figures' lives: social inequalities, institutional and non-institutional violence, discrimination, and racism, a path that the author continued in his later works Encruzilhada, published in 2011, and the graphic story Risco, from 2014, which was incorporated in the 2016 edition of Encruzilhada. The graphic novels Cumbi, first published in 2014, and Angola Janga, published in 2017, are the result, according to De Salecci, of an 11-year-long research about the history of slavery in Brazil, and more specifically about Palmares, a fugitive community of escaped and resistant slaves in colonial Brazil, which was also called Angola Janga, Little Angola. It is interesting to note in the context that Marcelo De Salecci began his trajectory as a comic book artist with the urban graphic narratives in contemporary Brazil, while he was realizing at the same time a more in-depth research on the Brazilian past. It is not surprising, therefore, that between these two phases of work, there are several aesthetic and stylistic analogies that create something that we could describe as an inverted continuity in relation to the genealogy of the work and the times represented in it. In the epilogue that accompanies Angola Janga, his most recent work, De Salecci informs his readers about his first contact with the history of Palmares and explains how the idea of this project crystallized. I quote, "A história do quilombo de Palmares chegou até meus ouvidos nos primeiros anos escolares. Uma colega disse, categórica, hoje é dia 20 de novembro, dia de Zumbi dos Palmares. Olhei curioso, mal conhecia a história de Zumbi ou qualquer outro fato da história negra no Brasil. Esse universo foi descortinar-se somente anos mais tarde, por influência do rap, da literatura e de filmes. Muito tempo depois, já na universidade, tive contato com textos sobre o antigo conflito da Serra da Barriga. Naquele momento, percebi que Palmares foi grande acontecimento, nos principais conflitos do século XVII do Brasil colonial. Mais do que isso, o maior levante escravo negro na América, comparável à Revolução Haitiana. Ainda vacilante, iniciei um primeiro roteiro sobre Palmares, tracei ali quais seriam os principais fatos e a linha central da narrativa. Esbocei alguns desenhos, mas não possuía as informações necessárias para dar cabo do projeto naquele momento. Passei os anos seguintes estudando textos e a iconografia do período. And in fact, those are the most important references that enter his narratives. Marcelo De Salecci interprets the undigested past as the root of inequality and current conflicts in the country. One last quotation in that context. The scars caused by slavery are still poorly understood and discussed. Brazil is an extremely unequal, racist country, and this is closely related to its past. We can't continue to consider slavery as something soft in our history. More than quantitative data, my intention was to speak from the perspective of enslaved Africans in the period and address the modes of resistance of these people, from the most individual way to the forms of collective struggle. There are few such stories in comic format that try to address this in a very personal way. We need fiction to try to overcome these limits and create new reading possibilities. In this sense, Kumbi and Angola Janga are not mere visual narratives of known historical facts about Mocambos, but rather a reimagination of events in the outskirts of Palmares from the perspective of enslaved Africans, represented, however, not as victims, but as agents of their own resistance. De Salecci's textual research is based both on chronicles and police records from colonial times, as well as more recent academic literature on the subject. The respective graphic stories and episodes in Kumbi and Angola Janga are often inspired by these sources that the author completes through fiction. He also visited Maceió in the northeast during the years of his research to obtain images of the landscapes and the places that would form the stage for his books. Presentation and the development of the characters and the narrative structure. Aesthetically, one can compare Kumbi and Angola Janga to his urban narratives in some points. The exclusively black and white illustrations are drawn with Indian ink. The panels in varying sizes are clearly defined and framed. As in Encruzilhada and Noite Luz, the author makes use of high and low angle perspectives to illustrate power asymmetries between, for example, the fazendeiros and the enslaved men and women. And in addition, contrasts also in parallel to the urban narratives, the bare feet of the slaves with the heavy boots of the farmers. An example that we can see here in the urban narratives, it would be the security guards' boots and the chinelos by the other protagonists. Far more often than in Encruzilhada, though, the characters turn toward the readers, giving them a sense of being part of the story, something we are going to see later on. The setting, too, could not be more different. In Kumbi and Angola Janga, De Salecci redraws 17th century colonial Brazil. So where in Encruzilhada and Noite Luz, São Paulo's cityscape forms the visual background, Kumbi's and Angola Janga's setting is marked by open landscapes, widely spread out farms, fields of sugarcane, and the sea, as we can see here, while the characters are depicted in their historical clothing. As in Encruzilhada, there's no external narration and direct speech is kept to a minimum, while the author focuses on facial expressions and body language. Unlike most male comic artists who until today dominate the comic scene, I would say internationally, even if we see that this situation is changing somewhat by now, Marcelo De Salecci does incorporate complex women characters in his works, as highlighted in the cases of the German translations by Lea Hübner. We see here, we see at the one hand the protagonist Kalu on the Kumbi cover and the warrior Andala. In the case of Angola Janga, also the only figure portrayed on the back cover of the first Brazilian edition. Lea, maybe afterwards you can tell us who made this decision, if it was the Austrian publishing house, or maybe even you in dialogue with Marcelo. I think this would be really interesting to know. It is important to mention that women have played an important role in the history of Black resistance. We can think, for example, of Aqualtune, mother of Ganga Zumba and maternal grandmother of Zumbi. She was the leader of a force of 10,000 men in the Battle of Mobilia in the Kingdom of the Congo in 1665. She was captured in defeat and brought to Pernambuco by force, but managed to escape to Palmares at some point, becoming the leader of a Mocambo that would later receive her name. The short story I would like to present in the following is Sumidouro from Kumbi. The title refers to the then common practice of throwing and thereby killing rebellious slaves in the deep wells of the farms. Sumidouro tells the story of a complex relationship between an enslaved woman, Kalu, and her master, Senor Tomé. The first panel shows a close-up of a skeletal bull skull, and in the following 5 panels, we move farther and farther away from this omen of death, and the wider angle reveals a man, recognizable, a farmer, a fazendeiro. At first, we see just his face depicted directly beneath the bull skull and facing the reader. We then see him standing in front of a bar holding a whip in his hand, and finally as a small spot in the distance. This first appearance foreshadows the violent end of the story, and we hear, or more accurately see him saying, Kaluna não podia ter feito isso. Não podia. Agora será diferente. At this point, we do not know yet who Kalu is and what happened, and an arc of suspense is built up, but the title on the one hand and the next panels on the other hand, already lead in a certain direction. Kalu, an enslaved woman who is forced to work at Senor Tomé's fazenda, is shown next to the deep Sumidouro well, apparently speaking to someone. Flashbacks told from her perspective reveal what happened to her. Abused and raped by her master, what we see only insinuated here, she's working in the kitchen. The door opens and a tear appears on her cheek. She knows apparently what is going to happen, and from this workless scene, very, very typical for Marcelo De Salecci's work in general, we can deduce that this is happening to her all the time. From this abuse, Kalu gets pregnant and has a baby, which becomes, despite the circumstances of conception, her only comfort in this hostile environment. Tomé's jealous wife, who we see below and on the right side here, steals her baby at some point and throws it apparently into the well. Because Kalu tells a priest about what happened, where else could you go? She talks to a priest. Tomé gets angry at her and brings her back to the fazenda with her hands tied together, and the plot thread from the beginning is resumed at that point. Tomé is determined to punish Kalu, who is waiting for him at the well, hallucinating the scene I already showed you. And just at the moment, just the precise moment when Tomé is swinging the wipe to strike her, Kalu opens her eyes and steps forward to kiss him. He first seems to be touched by this gesture, but then begins to strangle her until she stops moving. Again, here we can see De Salecci's cinematographic eye, as if he had a camera moving around his 2 protagonists and capturing specific details. This is also a quite typical page, the middle page for De Salecci's style. Kalu, as a slave, is supposed to remain passive and endure the sexual abuse. She's not allowed to have control over her own body. When she regains consciousness, she takes the knife hidden in her apron, and close-ups of their 2 faces show the emotional intensity that is created when she finally attacks him. Her tears, dropping into her hands, transform themselves into her baby. She holds it in her arms and sings a visungu, a Kimundo song in metaphoric verses that was used to calm children in this specific case before it soars up into the sky, where it transforms again and becomes one of the stars in the night sky. The way how this is depicted here could remind us of an inverted pregnancy. Her baby becomes smaller, more fetus-like, and it rejoins the cosmic whole. In fact, to endure the experiences of violence and cruelty, De Salecci's protagonists often search for explanations or solutions in Bantu mythology and find them there, which in some reviews of the book is referred to as magic realism, as I commented last week, and what I find somewhat problematic. Instead of a proper conclusion, I would like to finish highlighting a visual narrative inverted analogy between Carolina and Marcelo De Salecci's most recent work, Angola Janga, where he redraws the history of Quilombo dos Palmares. The moment when Carolina's diary is published is illustrated in a very specific way in Barbosa's and Pinheiro's graphic novel. Moving away farther and farther from the starting point, Favela do Canindé, we get a glimpse of São Paulo from outer space and see the writer getting hold of a star in the sky, which mirrors the title of the next chapter, Vedete da Favela, Favela Star, and indicates the achievement of Carolina's deepest desire. But we know already that this rise was only temporary. In Angola Janga, the whole narration is about the history of slavery and therefore takes place in colonial Brazil, just as in Cumbi, with one exception. In the last chapter of the book, Passos na Noite, Steps in the Night, we experience something that we could almost conceive as a return trip from Carolina's vision. Parting from the universe, we're zooming in on São Paulo until reaching a small side street where a little girl is sitting, a character that we recognize as Dara, one of the protagonists of Angola Janga, and in De Salecci's fiction, the daughter of Zumbi dos Palmares, the last king of Quilombo dos Palmares. Suddenly an abyss opens up and the girl is swallowed by it. She falls into a dark nothing, which ends in a machinery that produces some kind of maybe sugarcane juice, and therefore stands for the machinery of slavery, the undigested historical past that De Salecci makes responsible for the situation of many Afro-Brazilians today. Little Dara stands in this representation for a countless number of people that have to make a living in the streets of the Brazilian cities, just like Carolina Maria de Jesus, who we could see in a certain sense as a daughter of Zumbi too. With their graphic narratives, Silene Barbosa, João Pinheiro, and Marcelo De Salecci all contribute to a process of visual archiving and in relation to Afro-Brazilian culture, self-archiving, because all of them felt the lack of something, be it the lack of the presence of Afro-Brazilian literature in the school curricula, in Silene Barbosa's case, or the missing voices and perspectives of the enslaved women and men in official historiography in Marcelo De Salecci's case. Of course, both are interrelated. These modes of self-archiving are not only achieved by incorporating such different materials as photographs, newspaper articles, quotations, chronicles, police reports, etc., but by the very act of drawing and writing itself, overcoming the passivity of being portrayed with the activism of taking the picture. And I'm ending with a quotation from O Diário de Bichita, or as Carolina wanted it to be entitled, Brasil para Brasileiros. Uma palavra escrita não pode nunca ser apagada. Por mais que o desenho tenha sido feito a lápis e que seja de boa qualidade a borracha, o papel vai sempre guardar o relevo das letras escritas. Não, senhor, ninguém pode apagar as palavras que eu escrevi. Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Jasmin, for that detailed analysis of Carolina and the works of Marcelo De Salecci. Very fascinating comic books for sure. And thank you also for stressing the counter-archive function of comics and the importance of letting us hear voices which are usually silenced. That was really interesting and very important to be stressed out, I'm sure. I would like to open for the discussion. So if there are questions or comments on Jasmin Wrobel's talk, then feel free to enter in a discussion with her and inform us, as I already said, about your question in the chat. And of course, to ask your question, please activate your microphone and your camera, or just type the whole question in the chat. That would be working as well. Are there any questions or comments so far?
Maybe Lea could answer. I just saw that that Peter was raising his hand, but I actually had this question for Lea related to the covers.
Hey, okay. I'm always moved by these images, and thank you very much for your talk. I'm quite familiar with both of these books, or with nearly all of them, mostly those who translation I did, but I also was intending to wake up publishing houses here to give a chance to Carolina and her story, and this adaptation made by João Pinheiro y Selene Barbosa, but without success. This was before they won a prize in Angoulême, so I should give it another try. Or this is something which is a process that needs really time, and I don't know, but I think it's very important to give her visibility, and this graphic novel is absolutely a good thing. It would take a step just to publish it here, because I agree absolutely with you and this statement that it's not the point to have her as the testimony. She's a writer, and to show her as that. This is very well done and stressed in this graphic novel. Your question about this, the different cover is, I had a look. Well, there are 4 stories in Cumbe. Cumbe unites 4 stories, which are kind of parallel or side stories of the Angola jungle cosmos. And in all 4 stories, there's a presence of women. But Kalu is the strongest female protagonist. So I think it was the publishing house who decided to change the cover, because it's also kind of a marketing strategy nowadays that well, inclusion, minorities, female, well, half of the world has to have more representation. So this is quite known and is a more common practice nowadays. So they wanted to give her this space on the cover. Yeah. Okay.
And there was one question by Peter, I guess. Peter?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jasmin, for this brilliant presentation, which was really both conceptually very profound and also very illuminating in terms of the examples you were giving. And what I particularly liked is 2 things: that on one hand, you historicized, and you also have shown that there are so many interconnections, actually intertextual and interpictorial connections, in terms of also archival functions, like connections to certain photographies, but also to some of the documentaries we know, even newsreel documentaries. So there are these really profound interconnections in these ways. But then on the other hand, and I think that's a strong point you made, that it's not just a documentary value, but that it's actually a particular style or particular epistemology, really. It's not only a form of enunciation, but it's a particular epistemology, which we have also. And I think it's really not a coincidence that she was also a samba composer. Like other people, like, for example, Granjo Otelo, who was basically the first Afro-Brazilian to have a big resonance in popular culture, and also suffering from racism always, as being like the comical sidekick, but in fact one of the big geniuses comical culture, but also samba composer, etc. So I think that was really great to show all these dimensions, and also, and that was the point I was trying to make, that it's a particular form actually, and what was actually coming from orality very much. And how, and my question would be how in both cases this has been transformed. I mean, the styles of both of the comic examples you've shown are very different. And of course, Marcelo De Salecci is just also a brilliant, like one of the most outstanding, in my personal opinion, comic artists, because he really created a language that is, as you have shown also, that is so dense, and that really also creates with the particular form of, with the, let's say, the pictorial narratives, something very special. And so my question would be how you see that, how in these comics, these original enunciations that have been documented, both in terms of, for example, the Palmares, where we have documents that have entered in popular culture, even in oral traditions, where some of the songs, the resistance songs, have been traditionalized for centuries, even today, like in some of the parts of northeastern Brazil, and how you think this has been kind of, how this entered in a way into the specific styles and ways of telling and showing these stories. I hope I made myself clear. It's maybe a bit vague, the question, but that would be very interesting how you see that.
Should I respond directly? Maybe I just wanted to make a short comment to Lea's statement before, because there's actually something very interesting you could mention when you're going to the German publishing houses. Not only the fact that Carolina received the Angoulême Award, but I'm not quite sure now if it was what TV program it was, but there is actually, the only moving pictures of Carolina were made by in the frame of a German documentary on her, and this documentary was prohibited, censored in Brazil. It was not allowed to show it there, and it would be really interesting, because the reception story of Carolina in Germany is very significant. So I don't know if this could also be a bridge to go to Bahu Books and tell them that there's a very special connection, and that it would be really worthwhile, especially if they focus. You already told me that they have a very political, ethical approach to comics. So I think this might be worth to try it again. And thank you, Peter, for your very insightful comment for me. I think there is some type of iconicity, could I say so, that is quite interesting in Marcelo De Salecci, and that is different from, for example, João Pinheiro's style. João Pinheiro has published several graphic biographies also on other writers, Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs, when I'm not mistaken, and his style does not differ so much. It's a realist, naturalist style that is very documentary in a certain sense, impressive, but it's still different from what Marcelo De Salecci does. I think so too. And I think what Marcelo does is that he, and this is really important to stress it, because we have so, I know that in this group, we don't have to be defensive and say that comics are a serious medium, but you really have to stress that he did these books based on an 11-year-long research. He went to several places to take pictures. He read chronicles. He really did. He's professor at a school too, so he has this whole didactic apparatus, but to say something, yeah. To describe it, and at the same time, I think he located very well the voids there are, the Leerstellen, and where exactly in those histories, in those hegemonic narrations and perspectives and voices, where he could put his points of narration to complete them. by a fictional but nonetheless well-informed, very well-informed perspective from someone who really has studied this history and who managed to, as you said, not only give characters a voice that weren't present, that aren't present in the official historiography of Brazil, but to do so in an approximation of what could be really their own epistemological approach to that. I think this is what he tries to do in his works, and this is why he has received so much attention in the last years. I'm not sure if everyone, me included, sees this rich aesthetic network which Marcelo De Salecci is, but it was very impressive for me to see the last years, not last year, but in 2019, when we still could travel, when I went to bookstores in France and in Canada, and I went into the stores and I went to the comic section, and really the first book I saw, the first book that was presented prominently as above all others was Angola Janga, and I find this so impressive that he managed to bring the history of slavery in Brazil to a readership that is completely different and that has no idea. I myself learned a lot with Marcelo De Salecci, and Leah told us last week that he also is being quoted in the Wikipedia article. I don't remember of Mocambos or of Palmares, but this really shows what a reference he is now, and he is aesthetically absolutely worthwhile to from our perspective of literary scholars, media scholars. It's really very, very interesting work. Thank you, Leah. She just of the Quilombo, she just posted the link.
Actually, there is one question by Anna, but also a comment from Leah. I don't know if the comment maybe refers directly to the things Jasmin just said, so maybe we can start with Leah and then have the question, Anna's question. Thank
you. I just wanted to mention briefly, thanks Jasmin for this advice to the perception story in Germany. Actually, I read this book, Tagebuch der Armut, in Religionsunterricht. It was matter of our classes in gymnasium and in school and college. So, but this is not the case of everybody here. So I can't generalize. It was because of the teacher. And I tried in a publishing house specialized on graphic novels with biographies. And they told me, no, it has to be somebody famous. So look, like Kafka or something. Just does this as a comment on that.
So yes, so thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. I have a question in two parts regarding the aesthetics of the comic, because it's both where you presented the work of Pinheiro and of Marcelo De Salecci, and they both work in black and white, which I think is also interesting, because when drawing in black and white, all the skins become white, right? So it's not that you can feature people of color become white at the same time, which I think it's very interesting. And how do you contextualize this presence of black and white? Is it linked more to underground aesthetics? Is it a choice of, is it in a tradition, or is it more also maybe to make a break, so to be different than other productions of comics? And the second part is regarding the fact that in the comics of Marcelo De Salecci, the narration is carried mostly by images. My feeling is that there aren't many dialogues, and there are many pages which are no words. And since I also have now to approach a longer story on silent comics, so I'm very interested to know your opinion about how what do silent comics make with the narration and with the reader? So thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for your very interesting questions. I hope that I can answer them in a satisfying way. First, in relation to black and white comics, actually there is one Brazilian author, André Diniz, who draw a comic on Morro da Providência, and he has a very, very specific and different drawing style. And he, in this specific work, he inverted the colors. He's drawing in a negative form. So actually the figures become, the black and white configuration is inverted, which is also a solution for this, or not a solution is not the right word, but an interesting approach to this representation strategies. And in the cases of, I think there are two different motives actually in both cases. I think in the case of João Pinheiro, in relation to his style, is that it is quite matter of fact, because he has this genres of the graphic biography he works with, which is more based on including documents and newspaper articles, and really focuses on one specific person and portrays this person. I would say that Carolina's case is quite different still from for example, authors like Jack Kerouac or William Burroughs, but he has this specific style, which is quite typical of his work. And then Marcelo De Salecci, who also follows this chiaroscuro tradition, which for the comic in general is something that happens often, that is quite typical. Normally it is when authors do not want to use colors as they, in their symbolic manners, draw a lot of attention to different points that maybe are not required at that point. And I would say this is connected to your other question, because Marcelo De Salecci, he has a very poetic language on the one side. There are really, as you said, there are pages long without any captions or dialogues. There are no captions at all, without any dialogues, that are really poetic in how the pictorial configuration of the panels is. And at the same time, he has this cinematographic eye for situations. So he would far more use panel structure and size and the different angles to express something, and prefer that to actually written language. This is actually also something which is quite an interesting question for a translator like Lea, because you really have to be in point to translate Marcelo De Salecci, because there are so few words and there's so the conversation is so rare that you really have to be on point. I imagine probably Lea is going to tell us about that when she has her presentation in the lecture series. But yeah, I would say that he's a very poetic language. This also coincides a bit with the impression that you have when you read especially Angola Janga, which is a very huge work, which really has some features of a graphic epos, without wanting to use this traditional literary form, but it has something that really reminds me very much of this, yeah, poetic and at the same time very rich in detail and interconnections and intermediate references. So I don't know if this was a possible answer to your question, or I will stop here.
I do have a question, actually. I'm very grateful for your talk, because I think it dialogues on so many levels with all the other talks we had so far. Because we talked about gatekeeping with Veronique Sina in the very beginning, and which are the stories that are really getting to be read or heard or seen, and who decides about this. And of course also the question of counter archives and yeah, the topics we talked about last week, for example. So I think there are a lot of connections, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the medium to choose, because there is this critical gaze on the history, which is which is presented in both Marcelo De Salecci and as well in Carolina, because they both let us remember stories which tend to be forgotten, unfortunately, maybe. But comics also help maybe with this critical gaze to have a different perspective on the current society, and which often confront or is confronted or collides with the political situation, as you also talked or have shown before. And in this case, I think gatekeeping again is a word which is important, because not all the comics are turned into books, and not all the stories which are important to tell are told in a book and published. So I think, yeah, there is this contrast, but on the other hand, we have the internet and we have the new ways of publishing and the social media. Maybe that's a good channel to publish the critical gaze on the current society, even if the readership maybe is reduced by this, which seems paradox because it's the internet and everybody could read it, but I think some contents you find only if you're really explicitly looking for it. So that's a quite confused question, but maybe you can just comment on that a little bit.
Thank you for this very interesting question that also has me thinking a lot, of course. I think in the specific cases of Carolina Maria de Jesus, and also of what Marcelo De Salecci tries to do, the book format is really important for them, to have this written object that has this legitimacy, and in Carolina's case reflects also on her own writings, ending up in another book on her, but that at the same time contains parts of her work. And Marcelo De Salecci really has the wish to make a contribution to the history of Palmares, even if he is obviously transparent about using fiction as a strategy to fill in the voids that there are, but to give this perspective. But this is a really important point, I think, for them, to use this somewhat hegemonic medium, maybe the book, and publish these research results there. Whereas in other cases, and as you know, I wanted to present actually to Instagrammers or comic artists who publish on Instagram and use this particular structural form, which is like just perfect for certain formats of sequential narrating, because you can just swipe from one panel to the other. There are in the last years, we can see that a lot of subversive or rebellious or resistant characters appeared on Instagram, not only in forms of direct protest. For example, for the women's movements, we had Ni Una Menos, Vivas Nos Queremos, but also, for example, in relation to the representation of domestic workers in Brazil. There is this comic strip that probably several of you know by Leandro Assis and Priscila Oliveira, who have a series together. First, they had the series Os Santos, which speaks about the configuration of domestic workers working in the houses of Bolsonaro, Bolsominions, and they adapted this series actually to the current COVID situation, giving it the name Confinada, and are telling the story of an influencer who has also domestic workers at her home, who are the real protagonists in this series, and shows this really hard to understand, a world that is really hard to understand, and shows to show all the surreal forms of thinking that some middle upper class people in Brazil have, and how they treat the people that are closest to them, actually. Even if we consider the first person in Brazil to die of corona was a domestic worker who got infected by by the woman where she was working. So I think the internet gives this possibility to react in a very fast and specific way to certain phenomena in society, this is used quite often in the form of comic strips, or even this a bit longer configurations of different panels where a short history is told, but that reacts directly to contemporary societal problems and constellations. I don't know if probably my answer was really chaotic now, but I'm not sure if I answered you.
Yeah, you did, definitely. I think the readership is something which is interesting as well, I guess, because as you said, the hegemonic medium book reaches a different readership for sure, and it's important to reach them, but you have to use the book medium, I guess, right? And the internet reaches another audience. Yeah. Are there any? Oh, sorry.
No, I'm just, yeah, absolutely. And there are different marketing strategies. We have the marketing concept of the graphic novel, which allows readers who normally would not have read comics to say, well, this is a graphic novel. I'm just going to give it a try because it's something that has prestige and something that I can buy at a bookstore. So these book formats attract people who wouldn't normally read comics, whereas in the internet and on platforms like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, I mean, I think it's mainly Instagram because of the pictorial focus. There's a whole other marketing strategy and the viral aspect and the likes. It's quite interesting to observe those different dynamics and how graphic narratives are marketed and with what readership. Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments, observations? Peter?
I do have a very short question because we were talking about the reception and the different formats. And of course, there is a transmedia strategy, but I think we've talked about it really quickly before. It's very interesting to see that there is a shift in paradigm about teaching Afro-Brazilian history in schools and at universities that coincide particularly, I mean, it's not the very beginning of it, but particularly during the first Lula PT years, actually, when also in the curricula of the schools, suddenly you have a lot of topics and also authors that belong to a group or various groups traditionally excluded in Brazil, being Blacks and also Indigenous people. And I know that it really created a market for people, especially on topics about history in forms of fiction. And actually, maybe you could tell us some, I don't know if you have any information about that, but I would be very interested to know if besides the canon, which is usually like children's and adolescents, stories for children and adolescents, if the comics entered in the school curricula, because that created a very big market as well, because then suddenly the authors would really be able to sell thousands of copies. And as you know, even like the big editors like Companhia das Letras with the very renowned authors, they have often like 3,000 books they're only printing, you know, which is very little actually, and almost impossible for an author to live from it. But I would be interested if you have any information on that.
I'm actually not quite sure if I can answer this question. Maybe Lea Hübner would also have some thoughts about that because she really knows the book market well. And but what I really see a lot in Brazil is which is also an international tendency, but in Brazil they have really published a lot in the sense of Classics Illustrated, which was the American form of converting literary canonical works into comics without being too without those works being too interesting, to say the least. And nowadays we have a lot of different adaptations of canonical works like Macunaíma or Guimarães Rosa, and very different, with very different stylistic approaches that are really interesting and that are indeed entering into the school curricula and are being used. But it's interesting to notice that in those cases, it's really not a simple adaptation of a literary classic that you give to a child to make it more easier to read it, but a very complex transmedial approach and adaptation of those different works. But in general, if I understood your question correctly, the question if comic books, graphic novels are incorporated on a general basis more in school and university curricula is something I can't answer. At the university in Sao Paulo, we have a very, very huge research group on comics at Universidade de São Paulo, who they are really one of the biggest Latin American research groups, with Valdomiro Vergueiro, who is a professor that has been working on Latin American comics for ages. So this is something that is quite present there. And the bookstores, and this is something you probably know better than me, because I have been to Brazil, I think last time in 2017, so several years ago. But the bookstores in Brazil normally have quite a good section of graphic art, and not only national, but international graphic novels, graphic narratives that are selling quite well. They are expensive though, that's for sure, yeah.
May I add something? I am absolutely. I just can confirm, Jasmin, what you said, that the schools and also the libraries are fundamental for publishing houses. When I met Rogério de Campos and the Veneta publishing house, Angola Janga, etc. He told me that this is the fundamental, the most important market for them. But all this came down, it was already with Temer. I think it's really in danger now, this kind of market. I don't know which is the actual situation, but this has a big impact, politics, because of this campaign, school without political content, etc. So all this was absolutely in danger now. And I think in spite of it, Angola Janga is being used at schools, but it's all the question, because now it's more like dangerous to do this. And also there was a big bookstore, which name I can't remember. It was famous also for its comic section, and it doesn't exist anymore. It's so this is also a big impact on the market of comics in Brazil. Okay.
Can I just add something? Thank you for this comment. I was just remembering that I also would like to say, as Marcelo De Salecci is a professor at school, he's a teacher. He also teaches art at Universidade de São Paulo, but he teaches also for children. And it's very interesting. I don't know who already had the chance to hear him when he gives a talk. Lea often translates his talks, and therefore knows that when he's very didactic, and when he explains the history of slavery to an audience that isn't familiar with Brazilian history at all, he just manages to get all the people's attention and to really suck them into what he's saying. And he always shows his own little archive, meaning his research, his own pictorial archive that he constructed for himself, and that he also images that he doesn't by no means incorporate in his works, but that are counter images, that are racist images. He has collected all together to form this whole story of Palmares on a base that is well informed in all those different pictorial traditions and archives of systemic racism also that he has to know, because he is drawing against it. And this is really something that always impresses me very much when he gives a talk, to see his collection and his own archive he represents to explain us his approach to Palmares.
I'm so sorry to I have the task to finish this discussion because we're running out of time, but I think we really reached the core of the interest right now, because that's what sums up maybe all the presentations so far, that comics are, as Jasmin just said, counter images really on what's going on in society right now. And this could be in the internet, this could be on walls like street art, this could be newspapers, as we've seen when we talked about Luso Africa, but also the function as counter archives, like telling stories from the past which might be important or interesting for our lives today, as we just heard about regarding the Brazilian reality, but also when we talked about Portugal and the colonial past from Portugal, and the comics that really work with this to bring these images back into the public consciousness. So I think that's maybe kind of the core of what we talked about during the semester, and I'm so glad that the discussion was this productive based on your talk, Jasmin. So thank you so much again. And yeah, thank you. Thanks all of you for being here, and I hope you will join us again next week, because next week we are switching again to nowadays society and maybe the counter images again with La Cruz, and he's a comic artist from Brazil, depicting and drawing the current COVID situation in Brazil in a very bitter way, actually, with a very critical gaze, and publishing his images on Instagram. So there is maybe the bridge to the current situation. So feel free to join us next week, and I wish you all the best. Have a nice afternoon and a nice evening. See you next week.
Thank you so much. Bye.